Welcome to Civil Discourse. I'm Jamie Wojciechowski.
And I'm Marilyn Brown.
And today, I have a few different topics I'd like to discuss. Yesterday was the 4th of July, so I hope everyone had a good day. And kind of in that spirit, uh, I have a quote that I'll read to start. But what I wanted to talk about was kind of the differences between patriotism and nationalism. And then also the role, if there's a role, mindfulness plays in acts of civil disobedience. But we can start with the quote. Let me find it. And the quote is by Shepard Fairey, and it's, "I want to be proud of this country, but when aspects of our policy don't align with my ethics, I want to protest them and try to change them. Being complicit because it's the home team is nationalism, not patriotism."
Well, that's
Yeah,
a pretty
heavy.
succinct quote for that topic. I like it. That was a good choice. It's very
Right.
direct.
And it's interesting with I guess the fourth because I've always kind of had a weird relationship with the 4th of July, just because I think even as a kid, it always felt a little. I don't want to say weird. It just felt I was never quite sure about it because I felt a lot of the people who were who I was engaging with and seeing were kind of towing that line between patriotism and nationalism, and when it would kind of move even just a little bit into the nationalism side of things, it just naturally makes me feel a little kind of tense and concerned, if you will. And I think it's yeah. I'll just start there.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such a great topic because the Fourth of July and patriotism has kind of always been something that's been an interesting topic for me as well. And I think growing up in my family, um, questioning the questioning and protesting and activism has always been kind of just part of what I knew. And so I never really experienced the type of patriotism that was uncritical. Like the patriotism that I've experienced my whole life is critical of America. And that's kind of part of the reason why I think that we've moved forward in a lot of ways. You think about the civil rights movement, for example. I mean, if people weren't actively criticizing what was going on, we wouldn't have made the changes wouldn't have been made. And so for me, I've always had I don't want to just like say it was an automatically mindful perspective of it, but it was always just kind of, I love this country, and I also recognize that this country has a lot of work to do to move forward and have liberty and justice for all. And I've always been aware of that. And so for me, it's my experience of the fourth has been with that awareness the entire time. And I mean, these were conversations that we would have as a family on the fourth at barbecues and things like that. And so for me, it's never been criticizing our country has never been anti-patriotic to me. That's actually been what I consider really deeply patriotic. And I think now I'm seeing a lot more of a confusion between nationalism and patriotism, and like more kind of performative patriotism where it's, you cloak yourself in the flag and America's great and all these things, but then get very defensive if anyone points out or wants to talk about the issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess for me, patriotism, the difference is that patriotism is caring for your country and your society and the people that are governed by the country you're in, right? And with caring, there comes both that celebrating victories, but also criticizing when we're moving in a direction I don't agree with, right? So it's exactly what you're saying, where then nationalism is this kind of, I guess, in pride and kind of blind loyalty,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
right?
Like
And
you
I
said,
think that
similar to like a team kind of.
right, and it's interesting to me because it's, I guess, the idea of pride, right? And I think there's a mindful way to feel pride in one's own accomplishments and things like that. But I've never, as a person, felt pride for something I didn't do, right. I don't feel pride in being an American, like having been born here,
Right,
right.
right. Because it's chance that you were born here. I mean,
Right,
it's,
yeah,
yeah.
which doesn't mean I don't feel pride, you know, as an American, because I'm active in politics and in activism and things like that. Like the things I'm actually doing, I feel pride in, but not necessarily just because I feel like there's a lot of this, I feel pride because I'm supposed to feel pride, and it's kind of going into what you were just talking about, and I think we're seeing that. I think the two major political parties help drive that.
Yeah.
There's the media helps drive that narrative. You see it often that, yeah, if you're critical, you're anti-American.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's I mean, it's incredibly dangerous because that
Yeah.
leads to fascist rhetoric and behavior. But I think it's important for people who experience, I guess, patriotism in its true nature to kind of speak up and express how they experience it, because I think in the media right now we kind of do get kind of one viewpoint is more dominant than the other. And I was the reason I wanted to talk about this was because there was a lot about it coming on my news feeds, of different videos of people kind of having this debate, and a lot of times I agreed with what was being said, but it wasn't necessarily presented in a very mindful light, which is why I want to talk about it. But I am happy at least that it seemed like it's a conversation people want to have.
Yeah, for sure. I've definitely noticed a shift in the fact that we're having this conversation at all. I think in the last couple of years, you're seeing that people are actually questioning, like, what is patriotism? What is nationalism? What are these things that again, like you said, there's expectations. We're expected to kind of perform in a certain way to show that we are patriotic, but allowing ourselves to kind of question, well, what does that mean? And what does it actually mean to care for this country and the people in this country as a whole? And I think that's kind of where I've struggled with patriotism, is that I'm looking at everyone in this country as a collective. And I think that what we've seen is that a lot of the policies and things are not collectively supporting everyone. And then the other thing that, kind of going back to as a young person, I think part of my discomfort with, like, I guess performative patriotism was or this idea that because I was born in America, that I don't want to say that people are saying that we're better than other people, but I feel like there's kind of this, like you said, I should feel proud just because this is where I was born. And I feel grateful for the opportunities that I've had here. I feel grateful for and recognize that my life could be vastly different in a lot of other places. And so I recognize that. And so I'm grateful for it. But I think I get uncomfortable using the word like pride, because I don't feel like being American makes me any different than any other person. I really, at the end of the day, am a humanist, and I believe in all humans and want everyone to have the same opportunities and resources. And so for me, it's like, yes, I'm really grateful and happy that I'm here. and I also will do what I need to do to speak out where I need to speak out, so that we can move towards a place where where the America that we actually live in reflects my view of what it should be.
Right. Yeah, I think with, I guess, displays of patriotism or performances and things like that, I guess my issue is often that the intent doesn't seem to be what the intent is claimed to be,
Mm-hmm.
because I think honoring soldiers who have died, or things that have happened in the past of our history, I think is very important. But and sometimes I see like someone singing the national anthem, and there's a prayer or something in honor of something, and I think, oh, that's very nice that they did that. But then other times when there's fighter jets and all this other stuff, I'm sometimes just, I feel like there's a different kind of message there, kind of like the NFL with adding the displays of patriotism, and then you look into it and you say, oh, the government actually paid for them to do that because they wanted to affect society's image of government, right? And then that's clearly kind of a conflict, and there's a dissonance there that I start to feel, which I think is kind of unfortunate because it taints the it taints the what I think regular people are trying to do. And the other thing I want to bring up was, I think you touched on an important point of the difference is that for me, patriotism is about how can we collectively continue to make our country and the world better, where nationalism is often very partisan and dualistic, in that it's often us versus them. We're the best country, everybody else is terrible. There's people in this country who, if they don't like it, need to leave.
Yes.
Kind of that mentality, and it's for me, looking at it, I just don't see how that can be perceived as patriotic. And I get it, like when there's emotion involved and people are angry and stuff, they just kind of want to hear what they want to hear, so they're not analyzing it from a mindful perspective. But yeah.
But I do think that, like, I think you're touching on that point that a lot of people feel now that patriotism is kind of being used as like a weapon. It's being, I think I don't think everyone who's patriotic is using it as a weapon, but maybe more of the kind of nationalistic way. People are using that idea of we love America as a way to, like you said, force other people out, tell other people they need to leave. A lot of videos that I see, people are like screaming, I'm American, get the fuck out. Like it's recently, I feel like it's become kind of a means of like a tool for aggression for people. And I don't know exactly what created that or what's changed that, but I do feel like there's kind of a shift in how even just people are communicating their patriotism and how and when they're communicating their patriotism. Because I think that, like, I'm seeing, a lot of times people, if someone's protesting, for example, if there's a peaceful protest where people are protesting a concern for the immigration policy, for example, and then counter protesters will come and then be, covered in American flags and screaming, like you said, if you don't like it, get out, or things like that. And it's like, okay, so that's where I get very, very uncomfortable with nationalism, and where it can feel to marginalized populations like threatening, And And the other thing I wanted to touch on with that is that, part of what's happened in the last few years for me is that I've become much more aware of the disparity between what we're told of what the Black experience has been in the United States and what's actually been that experience. And so, couple of months, or not a couple months ago, 2 weeks ago, was Juneteenth, which is June 19th. And that's something that I've known about since I was little, because again, my, family of activists, and I remember my brother would tell me about it, and I just kind of didn't care because I was a kid and I was like, whatever, no one is celebrating this. There's no one's talking about it. Like, I'm not hearing about this. I leave the house and no one has heard of it. And so it wasn't significant to me as a young person, but now as an adult, recognizing how important that was, that on July 4th, when America's celebrating independence, Black people were not free. Black people were still slaves. And so what does that mean to us when we're thinking about that? And so I think for me, I'm much more aware of and trying to educate myself on parts of history that we weren't educated on. That's the other thing, is that I think celebrating our history and accomplishments and things is very important, but it's also important to celebrate a true history and to actually have accurate history. And that's something that we've struggled with for so long, and we still don't have. And so for me, I'm using my energy to speak more about the things that people aren't as familiar with, like Juneteenth, versus putting more energy into what already is saturated as far as the 4th of July.
Yeah. I think going back to what you were saying about feeling the shift, I guess, in patriotism, I think it's very much connected to our politics, right? And because I just see such a parallel, and our politics are so divided and so us versus them at the moment, that I think it's super easy to slip into that fascist kind of nationalism, because once you start kind of having pride for country that's based in a us versus them mentality, that's 100% what we're seeing. That's the whole, well, get out, you're not a real American kind of stuff. So I think that the lack of mindfulness in our political process is what's also resulting in a lack of mindfulness in how we display patriotism, but also feel like how we're supposed to experience patriotism, right? Because I think a lot of it for a lot of people is they think this is what an American is. This is how, if you love your country, you don't criticize it. You call out people who do, right? Mm-hmm. Or I think the people who feel that extreme, I think that's a small percentage. I think it's more, well, I'm an American. If you think differently than I do, then you're not an American. Mm-hmm. I think that's the mentality. I don't even think it's a conscious mentality for most people who think that way. I think it's just something they're conditioned to kind of feel and think subconsciously, based on our politics, based on our media, and kind of how things are, how we've been relating with each other in this country. But going on the other thing, I think where the mindfulness is starting to happen is because of that. Activism is starting to become more mindful, because it kind of has to. I think things are getting more extreme, so people are realizing if we don't actually have a real plan and try to understand these issues and the complexities of them, we're going to just keep faltering. And I think that's I think that's where that reflection on the 4th and the fact that for generations Black people were not free on the 4th, and I feel like this is the first year, and I think it's because Obama, I don't know what year it became a national holiday. Do you remember that Obama did it?
I don't remember what year. No.
It was, I mean, it was during Obama's presidency, but still,
Yeah.
this is the first year I feel like my news feed was full of that kind of conversation this year.
Mhm.
And I think that's really a result of activism
Yeah.
being more mindful. Because I think what happens is when you actively want to, when you're an activist fighting against something and you're truly trying to understand the issues, uh,
Mhm.
it's not just you against what you're trying to change. You also learn so much more, and your kind of worldview's broadened.
Mhm.
And then you see these new kind of things coming in because there's new perspectives that are presented.
Right, right. And it's so much more nuanced when we actually dig into it. And I think that's what's so important about the fact that there are more conversations and people are talking about it more. One thing that I also see, and I think there's extremes on both sides, right? So there's the extreme kind of nationalism display of patriotism versus an extreme, like, if you're an activist, if you care about marginalized populations, then you should not engage in any patriotic Fourth of July activities
Right,
or things
right.
like that. And kind of that's the other extreme side of it. And like I get that, and I think that for people that's totally a personal choice. I know I didn't do anything special on the 4th of July because I had other things to do. But I think that, that kind of extreme is also not really mindful. I think that we can still participate in the rituals that we've participated in with our families and with our friends throughout our life, but do it in a mindful way where we're able to actually talk about what's going on. I mean, I think you think about 4th of July gatherings, this is an opportunity in the middle of the summer, in the middle of the week, where you get together with family and friends that you probably maybe haven't seen since like the last, kind of big holiday season. And you can
Right.
talk about things, and you can talk about how you're feeling with things. And that's one of the things that we are constantly promoting to get to a mindful place, is being able to have these conversations and talk about things and talk about our different views. And so I actually think that, I think there's a very wide spectrum of what you can do with this, but I do think that there's a space to be able to move things forward and be mindful about it, and also still participate.
Right. And I think that's very important, is just that dialogue. I think for me growing up, uh, a big part of the problem was we always celebrated the 4th of July, but for my family, it wasn't a huge deal. We would have to cook out and go see fireworks and stuff, but there was never any. My family isn't overly patriotic. Everyone wasn't dressing up in red, white, and blue and singing the national anthem. But they were also had pride in the country, but it was never discussed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I never really, because of that, I never really understood it as a kid. So I was just observing the way other people behaved, um, which then I was seeing a lot of kind of disconnect or things that didn't make sense. Where I think if we just brought the mindfulness in and started kind of really taking a, I mean, it doesn't have to be the whole day, but just
Right.
taking a moment with the people you're with to kind of get to know them better and get their feelings on the holiday and
Mm-hmm.
how they experience patriotism. I think
Yeah.
we'd be much closer with one another and just kind of better off as a people.
True. True. It's funny because you talk about that, and I think like growing up, 4th of July was just a tiny bit different from, like, in my mind, from like Memorial Day and Labor Day. Like I
Mm-hmm.
feel like kind of all the summer holidays meant the same thing, and I didn't, until I was an adult, understand the difference between Memorial Day and Labor Day. And really, like, 4th of July just kind of felt like one of the other summer holidays, but with fireworks. And I think about that, and I think that is just kind of something we don't oftentimes actually talk about, why we're doing what we're doing. It's like, why do we have this day off? Why are we getting together? And so I think that that's important, and kind of talking about just having deeper conversations about about the ritual, about the holiday, and why we're observing it in the first place could really make a big difference in how people are mindfully experiencing it. And I wanted to ask you, because I know that you had brought up that you feel like you're seeing more mindful activism. And I wanted to ask you kind of, do you have any examples of like something that you've noticed where you felt like,
Um, I don't know if it's actually the activism itself. I think it's the product of people being more engaged and wanting to understand things more, like the
yeah,
Juneteenth thing. I think it was just everywhere this year, and I noticed it first because I was setting my calendar in May. I was setting it for June, and it was in my calendar as a holiday. So then I was like, and I knew what it was, but not the full history. And I was like, that's interesting. Why would Google put this as a national holiday? So then I looked it up and then saw that I don't remember the year, but in whatever year of Obama's presidency, he made it a national holiday. So that why it was there. And then didn't really think about it after that. And then all of a sudden, a week later, my news feed was just all about it, and in a mindful way. It was all about sharing what it meant and why it was important, and stuff like that. There was no, I think because there was no reaction to it yet, because it was kind of people kind of learning for the first time, that there was no, I didn't see any kind of unmindful response to anything. It just seemed very mindful. But I think things like that are a product of activism and mindful civil disobedience, and kind of creating that shift and creating a more meaningful dialogue about the issues we're facing and how people are feeling in the country.
yeah, yeah, definitely.
So moving on to civil disobedience.
Mm-hmm.
This is also a difficult topic for me because I just have a lot of conflicting feelings about it. And I guess my question is, and it has always been, can, and I think it, I mean I know it can, but how do you practice civil disobedience in a mindful way, right? And I think an important distinction to make right off the bat is that activism and civil disobedience are not the
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 same,
same thing.
right?
You can protest and be an activist without being practicing civil disobedience.
Mm-hmm.
But I think history clearly shows that civil disobedience is a successful tactic
Yeah.
in many situations. But I also feel like a lot of times it is not mindful, but also does it need to be,
Mm,
right?
man, there's a lot of questions. Trying to figure out which one. I think that I think civil disobedience. I like that you point out that there's a distinction between activism and civil disobedience. Um, and I do think that from what we've seen historically, I mean, the things that I can, the events that I can think of that moved the needle forward as far as gaining rights for different groups and things were those acts of civil disobedience that we ended up hearing about, from the bus boycott to the freedom riders, things like that. And so it is something that has been shown to be effective. And I think I do think that there's a way to do it mindfully. I don't know how to, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know how to decide whether it's mindful or not from viewing from afar. So, for example, yesterday, there was an act of civil disobedience at the Statue of Liberty that was trending, that became really popular. A immigrant from the Democratic Republic of Congo, a woman, climbed, I guess they were protesting the Trump immigration policy and asking that all the children be restored to their families. And so she there was a group protesting at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, and then she climbed the Statue of Liberty and was up there for like 4 hours, calmly sitting, and then she was arrested, and I guess she was in court this morning. I don't know what happened, but I view that as an example of mindful civil disobedience. Yes, she was being civil disobedient. Clearly, you're not supposed to be climbing the Statue of Liberty, and there was a lot of attention around it, but that's oftentimes what creates the awareness. And you know, I think we do have to do something that disrupts the status quo or the system or whatever kind of people are trying to do that day, in order to create a space where there is now more awareness, where people had to leave. They had to evacuate the Statue of Liberty on the 4th of July, which I think is a significant kind of statement for what she was trying to do and what those protesters were trying to do. And so I feel like that, you know, you see things like that, and I found that to be mindful, in that it's civilly disobedient, but she wasn't, you know, it was mindful in that, like, I didn't see her putting other people in, you know what I mean? Like, I didn't see something that I thought, well, this is really, like, I would be worried about someone doing this kind of civil disobedience because a ton of other people could get hurt or something like that. I didn't see any of those things. And so I felt like, awesome. You know, similar to like when the woman, I can't remember her name right now, but she climbed and took the Confederate flag down
right
years ago. Bree, I can't think of her last name. So those types of things, I think that I feel like that's a pretty mindful example of civil disobedience. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think we haven't talked about this since the early episodes of Civil Discourse, but the misconceptions of what mindfulness is, and I think there's the misconception that it's about being calm and kind of being at peace, and there's a famous Zen quote that I'm gonna butcher. I'm not even gonna try to quote it word for word, but it talks about Zen not being about being calm. It's about being forever prepared. And there's a part in the quote. There's a part about when thunder peals, you peel too, type thing. And I think, I mean, you see it in the history of kind of Buddhist practice of Buddhist monks kind of peacefully protesting and being disobedient through meditation, and I think that the issue for me in discussing this, and where I kind of don't know how to talk about it, is probably an ego thing of wanting mindfulness to always be the right thing to do, right? But mindfulness is the lens in which you act, right? It's not necessarily the act. Like, you can murder someone in a mindful way. What you're doing is not correct. You can use
you can do anything in a mindful way. Yeah.
Right. So I think for me to kind of look at civil disobedience, I kind of have to separate that right and wrong element from mindfulness, which it rightfully should be in analyzing mindfulness. But there's also part of my ego that doesn't want to allow myself to do that, because I instinctually want mindfulness to be the solution to everything, right? But unchecked, and I think it's also impossible for us to be fully mindful about something. Like, right, we're not going to have a full understanding. Like, we try to be as mindful as we can with the limited resources we have as humans. So for me, a lot of it is intention, right? Like, even if the intention, and there was of the woman who climbed the statue, right? If the intention was to help others with gaining as much understanding as she could, and then she acted that way. That to me is mindful, even if there would have been unforeseen negative
Yeah,
consequences,
I see what you're
right?
saying. Yeah,
And
totally.
it's
Because
also
you
the
can't
ego thing.
predict the consequences necessarily of something, and that doesn't negate the mindfulness of the action if there's consequences.
Right. And it's
Yeah.
also, I think the ego also gets into it in that me trying to be mindful, I put it on the other. I try to reverse it, right? So I was saying, oh, if it was someone who was uh, protesting because Trump reversed it and they wanted the children to be separated
Mm-hmm.
and they did the same action, would I consider that mindful? Right? And I guess my ego tells me, well, I disagree with their stance, so I want to say it's not mindful, even though my understanding of mindfulness tells me it's still mindful whether I agree with it or not.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, well, and also, how do we really know if it's mindful? Like, how do we know? Because I'm trying to, like, how do I decide if it's mindful what she's doing
Right.
if I don't know her reasons for doing it, her mindfulness at the time? Like, it could seem to me extremely mindful as I'm watching it, and then we find out later. I mean, we didn't find this out later, but if we were to find out later, it was a completely random thing, and there was no, there was no like plan. She didn't think any of it through, and she just kind of got bored and decided to climb up there for no reason. You know what I mean? But it's like a
Mm-hmm.
lot of times we're deciding the mindfulness of something based on our own lens and what we're viewing, but we can't really actually make that determination about someone else's action.
Right. And I think that's a test on if you're if you're using your mindfulness to judge their mindfulness, right? Because I'm like that was my first thing with it as you were
Yeah.
telling me about it, and I saw all of it about yesterday. The first thing is there's all these questions about like was this planned? Was this whatever, but I think those questions are what make my response to it mindful and what a lot of people don't do, right? And I think it's easier. I would more easily do that to someone like her who I agree with politically
Right.
than someone who was doing the same kind of protesting something I didn't. But that's part of I think the challenge of mindfulness, and I try to do it with both. One's just easier than the other,
Right.
but I think I think that highlights the problem. Is lot of people would say, "Well, I disagree with her, so what she did was wrong."
Right.
And they don't ask any of those questions of like, well, why was she there? Who is this person? What caused her to act in this way? Uh,
Right.
I think one, we've talked about this so many times. One, it leads to just a better understanding, and two, it engages our ability to empathize so that the understanding is even greater than just an intellectual one.
Right. So what you're saying is that we have to keep being more mindful ourselves and being more curious about what we're taking in and what we're seeing, and that's kind of how we figure out, or that's how we practice mindfulness, is by just continuing to like be curious about what we're seeing and what we're responding to and our own responses to those things. I think that's that important piece too, because I like that you pointed out that ego's push to validate what we like, what would agree, what's on par with our beliefs, and reject what's not. And so kind of having to do that extra work of asking yourself, well, how would I feel about this if the person
Yeah.
had different views than me? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think another important part of it is also realizing that mindfulness is a journey and a never growing practice, and that we still have to live in the moment,
Right.
right? So, with acts of civil disobedience, if we're just going to, at some point, you have to act, right? You can't just try to be mindful in the sense of, well, I'm going to sit here and just try to forever gather information about what it is, so I never have to engage my ego and act.
Right.
I think part of the journey is saying, this is where I'm at with my mindfulness. I need to make a decision. I need to act. Doing the action and then going back and reflecting on,
Mm-hmm.
was there things I missed? Was there not? What have I learned? I think all those things
Mm-hmm.
are part of the journey. So I guess for me, for civil disobedience, it depends on, right, the lens of which the the person who is acting
Mm-hmm.
is approaching it. If
Right.
they are reflecting on it mindfully during the process, then that technically is a mindful act of civil disobedience, where someone can literally be doing the same exact action with that person and not being mindful.
Right. Totally.
My head hurts now.
Yeah, this was a lot, but it was really appropriate for the time, and I feel like, again, where I've been seeing a lot of things on my news feed around the subject, so it was good to try and parse it out in a mindful way.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this too. The last thing I'll say is just uh, a big part of mindfulness is the self-care element, and kind of analyzing, I don't want to say what makes you feel comfortable, because a lot of mindfulness is feeling very uncomfortable, but I guess
Yes.
where your balance and an alignment is. And I'll give an example. Just in uh, there was a time when, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, where I was very active in protest,
Mm-hmm.
and all civil protest, but and nonviolent protest. But I was getting to the point where a lot of it made me personally feel unmindful.
Mm.
There's just aspects of it that make me feel unmindful, right? There's a lot of the chants and not really knowing specifically what you're chanting, or, well, I agree with this chant, but not this chant,
Yeah.
but everybody else is yelling and I'm here and they're all looking at me, so I kind of have to yell it even though it's not in alignment with who I am. And there's just a lot of things that started to kind of bother me about, or I don't want to say bothered me, started to make me feel like I wasn't being productive in
Right. And like
creating
it wasn't in
change.
alignment.
Right. And I wasn't able to effectively help
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
anything grow or anything change, because
Yeah.
I was out of alignment doing it. And once I realized that, I was able to find other ways for to create change that were more in line with who I was. And that's not saying I'm a huge supporter of peaceful protest every day of the week. Uh, it's just not, and I still go to ones that I feel very in line with, that I think are important for me to be at.
Right.
But it's not, for me, it's not the way I want to create change, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And and that's okay. I
Yeah.
think that's for, I think everyone needs to find the
Yes.
way they best can help create change, because we need people doing many different things. We need people protesting. We need people documenting the protest. We need people sharing what's happening. We need people who are organizing and in meetings while the protests are happening. Like, it's all these things are connected, and we need people doing all of it to be
Exactly.
successful.
Totally.
So there is really room, I think, for everyone to be doing the thing that they're aligned with. And I think if everyone was, their activism was something that was in alignment with who they were and their mindfulness, I
Yeah.
think we'd be seeing actually a lot more change
Mm-hmm.
occurring.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's no longer relevant to what we were talking about, but I don't know why
No,
I
no, I think it's
felt
I think it's
compelled.
relevant because I do think that that I think you're right. I think that, like, when people can find what's in alignment for them and what resonates with them. Because I do think we're at a place where people are feeling very helpless. And that's something I posted about this morning. I hear this comes up a lot in my sessions with my therapy clients. A lot of people are just feeling very, very helpless and like, what do I do? How do I help? And I know that people are also feeling pressure to do things that maybe aren't in alignment with them. Like you were saying, like going and maybe being on the ground and protesting or engaging in acts of civil disobedience if that's not something that's in alignment with them. And I think that you're right, that when we can do that internal work and figure out what actually does work for you, or try different things and be curious about how you're feeling and be aware during and listen to the signals that your body's sending and things like that. When you're doing it, you can be willing to craft an activism practice that works for you and that fits for you, because we all have different gifts and things that we're bringing to the table. And I think that you're right, when people are more in alignment and aware of where their strengths are, of what they can bring to the table, then we really can create a lot of change in a short period of time. I think that, and I kind of feel like I see that happening. I think that people are getting activated in their own gifts and in their own kind of strengths, and finding those areas of where they feel like they really can create some change. And I think that really, I mean, I know that helps me a lot with the feelings of helplessness, of being frustrated with things that we're seeing in the world. And it's empowering. And so I think that that's kind of a way to cycle back around to the idea of patriotism, and a way to be patriotic, and a way to try to affect change in the way that works for you and that's in alignment with your path.
Right. Yeah, and again, all these things are moving experiences, right? None of this is stationary. How we experience patriotism is not a stationary destination. How we are in alignment with ourselves is not a stationary. It requires intense mindfulness to constantly be like, well, I'm not aligned now because I'm at this place. What? You just don't go, well, I'm going to go back to alignment. You have to figure out, well, how can I get to this place? And sometimes you need, I need to go out of my comfort zone to realize, this is where my alignment is, right? I'm not fully comfortable with that. I'm only comfortable taking 3 steps at this moment. And as you get more comfortable, as you get more life experience, as you become more mindful, that kind of needle moves of what is comfortable and what it is. There was a time where I felt very aligned in protests and was front of the line, charging everything. It was just who I was. And as my mindfulness journey grew, I had just shifted in how I was seeing things and how I wanted to use my energy.
Yeah.
Homework?
I want to find out from people, do you believe in civil disobedience? Do you think that that's something that's effective?
Cool. And you can do that on any of our social media, but we are trying to create a community on Facebook. We have a Facebook group, Mindfulness in Action, Civil Discourse. And it's just a great resource to share kind of where you are in your mindfulness journey, any questions you have. We share a lot of different articles and things that are interesting to us through a mindfulness lens. So, yeah.
All right. We'll see you guys next time.
Have a good one.